When drafting our fantasy football teams, players tend to go off the board in similar ranges. That means the fantasy community believes those players will have similar production. Today, as well as the rest of the summer, we'll discuss players in groups of 2 or 3 in what we call ADP battles. The hope is to help everyone have clarity on all players when you're on the clock. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Prize Picks, the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. I'm Jim Coventry, and I'm joined by Anthony Cervino. Remember to follow Anthony at The Real NFL Guru. You can catch me over at Jim Coventry NFL. Today's show, Anthony Cervino and I will talk about the upside and downside of players who are commonly drafted in the first round of typical fantasy drafts. Yes, we're going to get the big names out here. We're going to paint the good case for them, but we're also going to point out anything that we have concerns about. And then after we break down 3 players, we're going to talk about what our final decision on those 3 are. I'll start out with the analysis on Christian McCaffrey. Look, McCaffrey has averaged 334 touches in his 2 full seasons with the Niners. He did miss significant time in 2020 and 2021. That's a little bit in the rearview mirror, but it is in his history. So injuries could happen, any player, but there is a history here. McCaffrey will be 28. We still expect him to have some prime years, but this could be the time where we begin to see a little bit of a decline. That said, the 49ers, they use McCaffrey perfectly. They use him as a runner. They use him as a receiver. They get him in space. 79th percentile broken tackle rate last year, still outstanding. 85th percentile yards after contact. And with the scheme set up by Kyle Shanahan, it just keeps McCaffrey out of danger quite a bit. I also want to point out in 19 games, so that includes the NFL playoffs, McCaffrey had at least 20 PPR points in 15 of those 19 games, and he never scored less than 13.1. Anthony, what are your words on Christian McCaffrey?
You know, what's not to love about CMC? You brought up the injury history. That's a foregone conclusion. Like, that's not even in the equation right now with the San Francisco 49ers since coming to this football team. He's been healthy. He has a terrific supporting cast around him, something he's never really had in the past with Carolina. So he has more open running lanes. And once he gets to that second and third level, he's an elite runner. He can make a lot of things happen. So when it comes to drafting somebody like CMC, you're getting him with either the first or second overall pick, depending on where you are and who's taken first. But I cannot get enough of CMC. And I know drafting running backs early, it's something that some people don't like to do, especially in the current form of fantasy football. But CMC, I think he is I don't want to call him the outlier, but he is that pick that can potentially win you your fantasy football league.
So, Anthony, we're going to go to our next player. We're doing 3 players in this ADP battle. We start with Christian McCaffrey. Anthony, why don't you start out talking about CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys?
Now, CeeDee Lamb, since he has taken over as the Dallas #1 wide receiver, you have to remember he opened his career with Amari Cooper there. But since they moved off of Cooper, we've seen nothing but sensational football out of CeeDee Lamb. 2022, he was a wide receiver, 7 fantasy points per game. And then last year, he absolutely goes ballistic. The #1 wide receiver in fantasy points per game, 23.7 PPR points a game. In each of the past 2 seasons, at least 156 targets, 107 receptions, and 1,359 yards with 9 touchdowns. Is that a safe floor? Anything can happen. Injuries can happen, but this is another player. CeeDee Lamb has yet to miss time due to injury. We also know he's in a contract year, as is his quarterback, Dak Prescott. They both have a lot of money to play for. And Dallas this offseason, we already know they didn't add any legitimate threat to CeeDee Lamb's target share. He was number 1 in targets, 8th in target share at 29.9%, and 4th in target rate. I don't see any of that going down in a year where Dallas is going to be possibly the most pass dependent it has ever been in the McCarthy Prescott era.
And I want to add a little bit to that, Anthony. Last year, in the 6 games before Dallas's bye, CeeDee Lamb only had 1 game with more than 7 targets. And then during that bye week, I talk about this all the time, but it's worth repeating. Dallas, Mike McCarthy must have had a moment of clarity, realized we can't run the ball. And they didn't. They went pass heavy. And it was Tony Pollard, and you mentioned this year. Now it's Zeke Elliott instead of Pollard, and Elliott's near the end. So that running attack's not going to be as good. But once Dallas made that philosophical change, remember I said Lamb only had 1 game with more than 7 targets through the first 6 games. From week 7 on, at least 110 yards in 7 of 12 games, 11 touchdowns. His targets were through the roof. What I like best about the usage, they moved Lamb wherever the best matchup was. And it sounds basic. Not enough teams do that. So Lamb, 54.7% of his targets were in the slot, which is great against 73% league-wide zone defenses. When it was a mismatch on the outside, he took that. So what he saw target-wise from the bye week on, and Anthony, you pointed this out, we could see more of the same. That target total could easily hit 190 this year. And that makes Lamb a potentially better player than he was last year as the wide receiver 1. Like you, I don't really see a lot of downside. We haven't had an injury history, so we don't have that. And Prescott, like you said, playing for a lot, Lamb playing for a contract. So I don't see much downside. And I like to talk about it. I don't have much here. So let's move on to Tyreek Hill. So last year, Tyreek Hill, for a good chunk of the season, he was on pace for a legendary season. He was well over like 2,100 yard pace for a while. And then you saw him get dinged up a lot. There were times you see him limping, missing snaps. Snap count was lower. But still, Hill still sees 170 targets for the 2nd straight year with Mike McDaniel running the offense. And 38% of those targets were in the slot. So we're, again, just like CeeDee Lamb, Hill was used where he was most optimized. Now, Hill has consecutive years with at least 1,700 yards under Mike McDaniel's coaching. The only things we should be worried about, Hill got dinged up last year. He'll be 30 this year. Tua Tagovailoa often underthrows Hill on long passes, and Hill has to fight back through traffic, come back, make his ridiculous acrobatic catches, to catch the duck that was floating. And if Hill even loses like a nano percentage of his superstar ability, those underthrown passes could get broken up. And that was a lot of production because Hill cannot get passes frequently that are like thrown out in front of him on downfield routes. And that's where Hill does a lot of damage. But again, if they use him underneath a lot, it's more hits he has to take. I don't see a big decline coming, but last year was a little bit worrisome. Anthony, what thoughts do you have on Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins?
I want to bring a little bit of downside to Tyreek Hill. Now, last year didn't really miss time, but if we look at his injuries from last year, because remember, there were times where he'd leave the game, be on the sideline, go into the locker room, come back. He had dealt with 3 different injuries: hip strain, bruised hand, and ankle soreness throughout the season. And then the one game that is glaring, week 14 against Tennessee, he gets banged up in that game. And you can make the case Tyreek Hill was never the same since. Down the stretch, week 14 to week 18, which is fantasy football playoffs, Tyreek Hill only had 1 wide receiver 1 week. He was one of the best fantasy wide receivers, one of the best fantasy football players, one of the most reliable players you can have. But when it mattered most, and obviously injury does play into it, Tyreek Hill just didn't
Anthony froze up, so I'm going to continue to talk here, and we'll see what we ever. So Anthony was talking about Tyreek Hill down the stretch and the injuries. Anthony, I think you're back. We lost you. You froze up for a moment.
Okay.
You were.
Am I back? Am I good?
Yeah, you're back now.
Okay.
You were finishing up on Tyreek Hill.
I was saying down the stretch from week 14 to week 18, Tyreek Hill, only one wide receiver 1 week and 3 games under 18.9 PPR points. That is not what I'm looking for when it matters most fantasy playoffs from a guy I'm probably taking with the 3rd overall pick, maybe 4th.
So let's rank them. Anthony, we have Christian McCaffrey, we have CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill. How do you rank them? And when you're ranking them, are there any contingencies as you're ranking, like saying, well, this guy is my number 1, but go ahead and rank them out.
I mean, my number 1, it's a toss up, right? Because if you play volume leagues and you have the number 1 overall pick 10 times, I'm probably going to want my fair share of both CeeDee Lamb and Christian McCaffrey. So I would kind of rank them 1A and 1B. And Tyreek Hill is obviously 3 here for me. I think there's more risk with Tyreek Hill than there is with CeeDee Lamb and Christian McCaffrey.
Very similar with me. McCaffrey is my number 1 pick because the running back position, positional scarcity, having the hammer over most running backs, maybe Bijan Robinson and maybe Breece Hall give McCaffrey a run, but the odds of McCaffrey being closer to other backs is small. But running back position tends to have injury issues more than other injuries, in my opinion. And in that case, McCaffrey offers risk. And if you want to have the safest 1st round pick, to me, McCaffrey has potential injury risk for that reason. In that case, I would move CeeDee Lamb ahead of him if you wanted safety, because there may be numbers that point things out. In my mind, receivers have a little better chance of holding up, especially with Lamb's track record. But like I said, McCaffrey 1, Lamb 2, unless you want the safety. And then Hill is number 3 because, again, the quarterback underthrowing passes, Hill getting dinged up a bit last year, Hill turning 30. There's enough uncertainty. There's not so much uncertainty on moving Hill beyond 3, but I'm not going to move him ahead of those other players. It sounds like we're in pretty good agreement there. Now, Prize Picks, best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. And Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats, and you watch the winnings roll in. Now, the posted yardage projection for the 2024 season for A.J. Brown is 1,275 yards. For Justin Jefferson, 1,375 yards. And for Deontay Johnson, it's 825 yards. I'll be going with the more on each of those numbers. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make RotoWire the number 1 daily fantasy sports app. Download the app today and use the code ROTOPOD for a first deposit match up to $100. That's promo code ROTOPOD for a first deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, next ADP battle, and I've lost Anthony Cervino momentarily. If he comes back, we'll click him right in. But this ADP battle goes with the next few picks and drafts, and that is going to be, we're going to have Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So now let's start this out with Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So first of all, Ja'Marr Chase. Last year, Joe Burrow started the season very compromised in terms of injury. His calf was an issue, not playing at a high level. And then we know late in the season, we know that Joe Burrow missed a number of games and Jake Browning took over at quarterback. Still, Ja'Marr Chase goes over 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. That shows how great Ja'Marr Chase is. Now, that said, Chase had a 25th percentile average depth of target last season. And a lot of that had to do Burrow's injury, Browning doing a lot of play action. So that can be explained. With the short catches, though, Chase made up for that with a 76th percentile yard after the catch rate. So again, proving he's an elite player. Now, that said, the circumstances around him, Ja'Marr Chase only had 10 or more PPR points in 9 of 17 games. So just a little more than half of his game did he hit that 10 PPR point threshold. But again, a lot of extenuating circumstances, right? The last time, though, we saw a full season of Burrow and Chase together, it was Chase's rookie year, 2021. We got 1,455 yards and 13 touchdowns. Now, it's hard to take that season and move it forward on its own merits because the league was playing a lot of one high safety looks against the Bengals. And we remember Chase having some absolutely tremendous high volume games, 250-yard games. We saw that. So, and then once the league kind of went to those two high shells, then that kind of changed things up a little bit. And so that became, a big difference at that point. So all that said, Ja'Marr Chase is going to continue to see heavy volume, but we're going to see those two high shells. So the big plays haven't been there like they used to be. Remember, in 2021, the rookie year, 18 yards per reception for Chase. But in the last 2 years, 12.2 and 12. So that said, the two high shells have forced that yard per reception way, way, way down. And Chase also had 350-yard games in his first year. He's only had 2 games at 149 yards in the 2 years since. So those big plays and those big games have dried up significantly. Now, last year, Chase was used well, 35% of the time in the slot. That was good. Chase has had some injury history. He's missed some time. So all that said, we know he's a superstar. Joe Burrow, when he's on the field, certainly helps the upside of Chase. But all that said, Chase has not yet had the type of season that puts him at the very top of drafts. He hasn't had that 1,600-yard season, even a 1,500-yard season. He hasn't had that yet. And so those that are worried, maybe the best is yet to come. Maybe we just haven't seen it. But all that said, it's also possible that it might not be coming. Maybe we've seen the best. And we don't question the talent, but it is not a great situation. All right, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings is the next player. And last year, Justin Jefferson had the hamstring injury, missed significant time. The per game production for Justin Jefferson was in line what we saw in both 2021 and 2022. And there was no fall off in the play overall when he was healthy. And last year, there were only 5 healthy games that Jefferson played with Kirk Cousins. Obviously, Cousins is no longer with the team. But in those games, Jefferson, 7 catches a game, 142 yards, off the charts. A little more than half a touchdown and 10 targets a game. But here's what I want to point out. Last 4 games of the season, you had Justin Jefferson finally healthy again, playing with Nick Mullins. In those 4 games, now we'll cite it with the Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins was 7 catches a game and went to 7.5 in those 4 games at Mullins. We had 142 yards a game with Kirk Cousins. May not have been sustainable. 119 yards per game with Nick Mullins. Still 1,700 plus yard pace, right? Little lower touchdown rate. Went from 0.56 to 0.5 at Mullins, but the targets went from 10.6 to 11. So basically, aside from a little bit of loss of yardage, everything else stayed the same with Nick Mullins compared to Kirk Cousins for Justin Jefferson. So this year, now, if you want to believe Greg Cosell, and I put a lot of stock in what Greg Cosell says, Greg Cosell talks about the importance of J.J. McCarthy when he's going to get into the situation as a starting quarterback. He was drafted in the first round by the Vikings. Greg Cosell thinks that J.J. McCarthy's a project. Cosell believes that Sam Darnold will be the starting quarterback, and it may be for a longer period of time. And at that point, you got to ask yourself this question. Can Sam Darnold do at least as much as Nick Mullins could? Now, all that said, if Sam Darnold crashes and burns quickly, Mullins is still on the roster. So Mullins could step back in and get Jefferson back to that production. So I want you to understand that is there as well. And in this offense with Kevin O'Connell, we know that Jefferson can get open on his own and instantly, but that offense schemes receivers open well very quickly also. So that's going to help Jefferson. And you have to think that any quarterback that has struggles, has issues, like Darnold's had much of his career, you're going to get that ball to Jefferson as often as you can because it lessens your margin for error. Jordan Addison's a very nice receiver, but nowhere in the stratosphere of Justin Jefferson. TJ Hawkinson, probably out till at least Halloween. He didn't have surgery on that knee until late January. So even a 9-month recovery time, if it goes that well, you're still looking Halloween. So we should see excessive target share for Justin Jefferson. We don't like the quarterback play. And we've seen players like Devontae Adams have struggles because of bad quarterback play. We saw it last year with Aiden O'Connell. So that was a problem. But Justin Jefferson so far has done well when he's had bad quarterback play. All right. Amon-Ra St. Brown is the next player, Detroit Lions. So St. Brown plays a ton in the slot. Will play outside on occasion, of course. 2 receiver sets certainly will do that. St. Brown has improved significantly in terms of production in each year of his short career. And the league, and I say this all the time, 73% zone defense the league plays. Attacking defenses with the slot is an ideal approach. And Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator, great at scheming up the middle of the field. Jared Goff is at his best when throwing to the middle of the field. So this is a perfect marriage for St. Brown, all things considered, in terms of optimizing his skill set. And 56.3% of the targets that St. Brown saw were in the slot. So again, he's used on the outside a little bit, but man, he can really tear up the slot like very few others can. Now, here's the thing. Last year, St. Brown's numbers were better than I thought were possible from a slot receiver. 119 catches, that's normal. I could see a slot receiver getting that. 1,515 yards. That number was pretty incredible. So all that said, with St. Brown, that having that level of production was outstanding. And he had 10 touchdowns. Also, St. Brown had 163 targets. So we've seen elite fantasy producer. And last year, the floor was insane. Only one game with less than 49 yards. So very few players had the floor. And St. Brown held below 70 yards only 3 times. My only concern for St. Brown, if Jameson Williams becomes the player they drafted, first-round type player who would command some targets, if Jahmyr Gibbs is used more in the passing game than he was last year, again, 2 higher first-round picks the team really wants in their plans, it might be hard for a slot receiver primarily to get 163 targets. And so St. Brown might not be able to repeat those numbers if he doesn't see the targets. Anthony, thoughts on St. Brown?
Amon-Ra St. Brown, he doesn't bring the ceiling of other receivers we talked about, like Ja'Marr Chase, who you just talked about while I was absent, or a Tyreek Hill or a CeeDee Lamb. But if you are looking for a stability piece, a high floor first-round draft pick, he's probably not going to bust barring injury. We know his role in the offense because he's getting the OC back. He's getting the quarterback back. And the only big upgrade to the wide receiver room is Jameson Williams, who has a completely different role. Then Amon-Ra St. Brown's your guy. Again, we're not drafting Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's not the biggest deep ball threat, only 40th in deep targets last year, but he was heavily used in the red zone, 3rd in red zone targets with 25. So I like Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you want to play it safe, he's one of those players that really can't miss barring injury.
So, Anthony, we're going to rank the 3 players. We're going to take Ja'Marr Chase, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown. How do you rank the 3 of those players?
This is tough because of Ja'Marr Chase. And I am very, very high on Ja'Marr Chase, but there's a lot of factors that I'm sure you went over, like injury concerns with Joe Burrow and how this offense is going to be without Callahan. But I'll still rank Ja'Marr Chase number 1 because he was on pace to have a monster season pre his own injury and, of course, the pre-Burrow injury last year. So I'll go Ja'Marr Chase number 1, St. Brown number 2, and then Justin Jefferson number 3.
So I am with you on Ja'Marr Chase. I think, look, we don't know if Burrow gets hurt again. When Burrow's on the field, Chase has an elite quarterback. Also, it helps having T. Higgins on the field, too. I mean, it's not just one threat to receiver. And I believe Chase sees double-digit targets in almost every game he plays. And even though the best season he's had was 1,455 yards, I think Chase is in play for that type of season with potential for more. So I just going to go with the best quarterback. I'm going to go with the most, the talent of Chase together. I put him 1, but I'm going to put Justin Jefferson ahead of St. Brown. Here's why. Again, I'm worried about the quarterback. I'm definitely, but because of what I saw with Mullins, and Mullins is still on the roster. Again, so if Sam Darnold completely is horrible in week 2, week 3, and JJ McCarthy's not ready, they go back to Mullins. I've already seen just Jefferson can play at a 1,700-yard pace. And Jefferson, outside of his rookie year, he had 1,400 then. He had 1,600 his second year, 1,800 his third year. So Justin Jefferson, the floor-ceiling combo, he can be the wide receiver overall one, even maybe with a lesser quarter. So I'll put him 2. St. Brown, the only reason I have him 3, the stability, like Anthony said, is off the charts. But that said, I still don't know how a slot receiver primarily got a 1,500-yard season. I just cannot see another step beyond that. That has to be a highest end number. And I think Chase can access more than that. Jefferson has already had multiple seasons with more than that. So I just think St. Brown. But the safest pick is probably for floor St. Brown. But it's going to be Chase, Jefferson, St. Brown. Anthony, we've launched the new RotoWire Picks app. It offers recommendations and predictions for fantasy pick'em and player props on platforms like Prize Picks, BetMGM, and more, covering just about every sport. It's free to download on Apple and Android. You sign up within the app for a subscription to unlock all the features. Existing RotoWire.com subscribers get instant full access to their login. Just go to RotoWire Picks in the App Store. We have it on Apple. We have it on Android again, so just check it out. We're going to talk more ADP battles after we take a short break. All right. So what is with fantasy football scores looking like an NBA All-Star game? Let's get real with Acme Real Fantasy Football. The top pro teams average around 28 points a game. This is how Acme Real Fantasy Football scoring system is based. The system is also very accurate compared to the actual game score. Each team drafts only 9 players, filling the primary positions. Benches are only used for injured and bye-week players. This leaves 200 free agents available to improve your team. Weekly waivers give preference to the bottom of the standings. League rankings are always changing, keeping it competitive the entire season. Acme Real Fantasy Football also has a one-of-a-kind playoff format, selecting a new lineup each week. All teams are competing from week 1 through the Super Bowl. 12-team league start at only $120. Go to acmerealfantasyfootball.com and sign up today. Anthony, our next ADP battle. A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. I'm going to start out with the lead on A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown has had very similar production in his 2 years with the Eagles, despite different coordinators on offense. Of course, Jalen Hurts has been there the whole time. And the average in those 2 years for A.J. Brown, 96 catches, 1,476 yards, and 9 touchdowns, 2-year average. Now, last year, I want to point out, through about week 7, Brown was on pace for almost 2,000 yards. What happened? Well, whether Nick Sirianni or Brian Johnson was calling the offense was figured out by the league's defense, as they knew the Eagles wanted to throw deep and they had no answers. Once that was taken away, the Eagles' offense dried up, fell off. And I know Jalen Hurts was dinged up a bit too. All that said, A.J. Brown, in my opinion, is right there as the best receiver in the game with Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, Jahmyr Gibbs, just does it differently. And I believe that bringing in Kellen Moore this year is going to be a big boost to Brown. We'll know they'll start throwing downfield, but Kellen Moore uses that to set up everything underneath. And Brown can win on every route in the book. So even if we took Brown's baseline of the last 2 years, we took that 96 catches, 1,476 and 9, just took the average, what he was doing. That's still going to make him a strong first-round pick. But I believe there's ceiling for a legendary season with A.J. Brown. In terms of downside, earlier in his career, he missed some time. That hasn't been a case in Philadelphia, so I'm not worried about that. Jalen Hurts had some struggles between injury. But again, I don't see that as much of a drawback as Brown has gotten it done. What are your thoughts on A.J. Brown, Anthony?
I'm with you on A.J. Brown. I think there is a path for A.J. Brown to finish as a top 5 or better fantasy wide receiver in PPR. You mentioned the pace he was on last year. And last year, it wasn't about A.J. Brown falling off. That entire Eagles offense and defense and team overall fell off down the stretch. What I think is going in A.J. Brown's favor is Kellen Moore. And I get the last thought that people had about Kellen Moore. Well, he was supposed to make this Chargers offense ascend. They had a lot of injuries and otherwise. Those first few games when that Chargers offense was fully healthy, it was humming. Now he comes to Philly. This is the most talent that Kellen Moore has ever had, even more talent than those Dallas teams. When you look at the wide receiver, the quarterback, the offensive line, and now the running back. And some people might think all of these additions, like a Saquon Barkley, could take away from A.J. Brown. But I want to comp this situation almost to the San Francisco 49ers, to where we could see one of those seasons like they had last year where everybody popped in fantasy, and it was one of the most efficient offenses in the league, and if not one of the most efficient of all time. I think we could see similar out of A.J. Brown and this Eagles offense overall. As far as the downside, there is the downside of other pieces like Saquon Barkley, because sure, he can take away some of those red zone opportunities. They did extend Devonta Smith this offseason. Maybe they get him more involved. But if this Eagles offense plays the way I think it will, and let's face it, this Eagles defense is a work in progress. In theory, they should be playing in a lot of shootouts, and they're going to have to throw the football and score points to win. And if that's the case, A.J. Brown could be a big-time part of it, and I would draft him over some of these other wide receivers we're about to talk about.
Anthony, the next receiver in this ADP battle, first we had A.J. Brown. Now we have Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. Start us out by talking about Puka Nacua's prospects for 2024.
Puka Nacua obviously came out of nowhere last year. And when you look at the total package, 17 games played, 159 targets, 105 receptions, almost 1,500 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. Can he build on that? And my answer, I'm going to start right with the downside. I think we're drafting Puka Nacua at his ceiling. We have to factor in Cooper Kupp is still on this football team. Demarcus Robinson looks like a new player as the 3 on this football team. They still have Tutu Atwell. And of course, they want to run the ball in the Sean McVay offense. Not only do you have to worry about Kyron Williams, but also Blake Corum as well. So I'm fine with Puka Nacua. I'm not in love with the ADP in the back of the first round. I just don't know if there's room for Puka Nacua to build. And we also have to factor in, yes, Puka Nacua was healthy, but are we going to get another full season out of Matthew Stafford? Because if Matthew Stafford gets banged up and misses time, Puka Nacua and the rest of this Rams offense is going to suffer.
So as I'm going to add in a bit here, and I like your call on Matthew Stafford having to stay healthy, and you intimated this, if the coaches are, it's not just coach speak, and Cooper Kupp is really, really back to full health, like they're indicating he wasn't, then if Cooper Kupp is back, that's going to be a hit on Nacua. And it was early in the season when Kupp came back. We saw Nacua take a drag on his targets for a while. But that said, Kupp is aging, and I tend to think more it's an aging player. The third thing I want to point out about Nacua I'm worried about is Nacua takes a lot of big hits, and we frequently see him laying on the ground for an extended period of time. And last year he got up from those. You keep taking big hits from the big boys in the NFL, and I know they're talking about him getting in better shape in the offseason. Doesn't matter. You're going to take big hits time after time. Eventually, they will win. And so I'm very worried about Puka Nacua then. And as great as Nacua's season was, he had the rookie record for yardage, but that doesn't even count the 181-yard game he had in the playoffs. So, I mean, it was just insane how good he was. And the beauty of Puka Nacua is that the Rams run 3 receiver sets over 90% of the time. But unlike the Bengals, who spread the receivers all over the place, the Rams run everybody tight. And the reason is they need their receivers to be blockers, but then also to option out in the routes. And so Nacua is very good at blocking. But the defense, it's hard for them to account for a player going from a blocker to receiver. And Sean McVay is perfect at setting up his receivers for success. I still believe if Puka Nacua was on 31 other teams, it would have been a struggle to get to 400 yards last year. But he was a Sean McVay, and he was in a perfect situation. So, again, I am worried about potential durability. I'm worried, like Anthony, about Matthew Stafford holding up. A smaller degree that Cooper Kupp goes back to prior form. I don't think that's a strong case. But like Anthony said, I do think we're drafting Nacua at his absolute ceiling. I don't see a Cooper Kupp season like that 1,900 yard. I don't see that coming out of Puka Nacua. So that's a great player, great situation, but he has a lot of things that need to go his way. Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets is next. And I'll start out by saying Wilson was one of the victims of the worst quarterback play I've seen during his first 2 seasons. Last year was horrific. I mean, Zach Wilson was terrible, and then he went out, and then we saw all kinds of bad options come in. And so Garrett Wilson has not been done any favors. Now, Garrett Wilson has averaged 158 targets his 2 seasons. So the coaching staff knows how important it is to get him the ball, but the off-target passes. Garrett Wilson catches 56% of his passes. Not his fault, just bad passes, right? And then yards after the catch. We know that Garrett Wilson can be an absolute beast, but when the ball is thrown behind you and you're just struggling to try to get your hands on it, you're not going to get any yardage after the catch. And also defenses, especially on obvious passing downs, they had nobody to worry about but Garrett Wilson. And with bad quarterback play again, that brought the worst out of him. So Wilson's averaged 1,073 yards and 3.5 touchdowns with horrific quarterback play, worst possible scenario. Aaron Rodgers is in now. And we don't know what level he's really going to be at. He's 40. We haven't really seen him play in a while, but he's going to be way better than what they had. And we saw last year, and I know it was practice and it was training camp, but we saw a connection between Rodgers and Wilson. Rodgers is no fool. He's going to get the ball to his alpha receiver as frequently as possible because he knows his receiver can win games for him. Garrett Wilson is a superstar. And we haven't seen it yet, but we know he is. So all that said, even Anthony, I'll let you mention the Tyrod Taylor thing. I'll save that for you. But Garrett Wilson last year, I aggressively drafted him thinking with Aaron Rodgers, we could see at least a 1,400-yard season. And I thought there was ceiling for a lot more. He's the same player he was going into last year. We just have to wipe off a lot of the stink that happened from the bad situations. But again, I think he's an elite receiver. Anthony, talk about Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets.
You know, like you, Jim, I was all in on Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, and this Jets offense as a whole last year, and it kind of blew up in our faces. Now, when it comes to the situation going to this year, if you bought into that Jets offense last year, then it makes sense to buy back in. Now, the Jets offensive line, they brought in a few new starters. They're going to protect Aaron Rodgers. You know, you mentioned Tyrod Taylor. Even if Aaron Rodgers was to miss time, Tyrod Taylor is not only one of the better backups in the league, but he's also I wouldn't say a monster upgrade over any other quarterback that possibly Garrett Wilson has ever had throwing him the football in his young career. So I think the addition of Tyrod Taylor, that safety blanket, does raise the floor of Garrett Wilson. Now, Garrett Wilson has seen 147 targets in his rookie year, 168 last year. Why didn't he produce in fantasy if we're chasing volume? His catchable target rate, he was 65th amongst wide receivers in that category. Well, what does that mean? 114 of his 168 last year were catchable. They were not quality targets. That will change this year with Aaron Rodgers and you know, knock on wood, if it did have to go to Tyrod Taylor. I'm buying into Garrett Wilson. And yes, it could have burned a lot of people because we were drafting Garrett Wilson right around the same place last year too. And he finished as a wide receiver 32 in fantasy points per game. I am willing to buy back in one more time, knowing what we know, because Jim, you did hit the nail on the head. In those training camp highlights, there is a connection. They were even on Hard Knocks last year. There is a connection with these two, and I think the ceiling for Garrett Wilson, if all the stars are aligned, he could be Aaron Rodgers' next Devontae Adams.
100%. Now let's rank them. A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua. What's your rank?
For me, I'm going A.J. Brown. I'm going Garrett Wilson. I'm going Puka Nacua. And the reason why I'm putting Garrett Wilson ahead of Puka is because of that ceiling. Like I said, Puka Nacua had a sensational season last year. I just don't know how much more room there is to grow. And if you're looking at, pure ADP to ADP, I have Garrett Wilson ranked ahead of Puka in the back of the first, where I have Puka as an early second-round pick.
A.J. Brown, for me, is not just easily the number one. I actually have him higher than the other tier. ADP, you can get him pick 9, pick 10. But that said, he might not get CeeDee Lamb level target share. But I think outside of that, A.J. Brown can match any other receiver in the league, especially if Kellen Moore utilizes him. Garrett Wilson, for me, is second. As we said, the quarterback upgrade is massive. This is an elite superstar. Third is Puka Nacua, only because he needs, in my mind, things to go his way. Stafford's health, Cooper Kupp not getting back to prior form, and Nacua recovering from all those big hits he takes. So I think there's more question marks there. Hey, is there something you wish your fantasy league had or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? We'll look no further because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college football fantasy leagues. Create or join a fantasy football commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top fantasy football platform in the industry. Coming from another service? No problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current leagues and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong or make a mistake in dropping a player? Fantrax commissioner tools allow you to undo any move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/RotoWire today to enter for your chance to win tickets to any regular season game for you and your entire league, plus $6,000 in spending cash. That's right, tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing leagues for more chances to win. Again, go to fantrax.com/RotoWire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. Anthony, our last ADP battle for today. Breece Hall of the New York Jets, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. And although he goes a little bit later than those, we're going to put Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions in this batch as well. Anthony, start us out with Breece Hall.
Yeah, I get to gush about another one of my guys on the New York Jets. People think I'm a Jets fan, the way I love this football team the past 2 years. But Breece Hall last year, he was the running back 6 in fantasy points per game and the PPR running back 2 overall. And you know, there's a lot of different stats that you can, you know, that jump out at me. But Breece, he was 33rd amongst running backs in red zone touches. Most of the time, if you're finishing as a top 2 or 3 running back, you're dominating the red zone. He only had 29 red zone touches and 1 goal line carry. Now, what helped Breece last year? Well, the bad quarterback play, he ate week by week off of the check down, 76 receptions for 591. So if we believe this Jets offense is going to take a step forward, maybe Breece Hall does not get those pass catching opportunities, at least not at that rate. But where I do think he makes up for it is the increased red zone looks. This team, in theory, should spend a lot more time inside the red zone, which means, can we make a case that maybe Breece Hall loses 26 receptions, and he hits around that 50 reception mark, but he scores, a good 7-8 more touchdowns if this team indeed operates the way I think it should. So I think that's going to cancel each other out. And we also know, like I said, Breece was the PPR running back 2 last year on one of the worst offenses in football. I don't want to say that, he's bust proof, but that takes a special player to perform at that high of a rate on an offense that bad.
I won't add a lot here. As a rookie before the ACL injury, Breece Hall was averaging 5.8 yards per carry. I know it's a small sample size, but he had no offensive line that year. It was terrible then. Really no credible passing attack, and yet he was seeing stacked boxes and dominating. Like you mentioned last year, Anthony, he did it as a receiver, so we know he can dominate that way. The yards per carry went down to 4.5, but again, it was seeing at least 8-man boxes. Sometimes teams just sell out everybody to stop the run and obvious passing downs. So Breece Hall still was a good runner in those situations. You bring in Aaron Rodgers, defenses have to respect the passing game. Hall, an upgraded offensive line, should see more room to run. Again, whether it's a runner, a receiver, he has shown us he's an elite player who could do it so many different ways. Yes, the ACL injury is in the past. That isn't his injury history. But that said, he's still young, and it's very hard to bet against Breece Hall. The next player we'll talk about is Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. Look, coming into the league, some people thought he was a generational player. I thought he was a very good player. All that said, fantasy managers were very unhappy. Arthur Smith's offense, which had been dominating in the run game, Arthur Smith didn't have any answers last year. The league was making a lot of adjustments at light boxes to stop zone runs, and it never got fixed. And also, Robinson did not see enough work. He only had 20 carries once. In 13 games, he had 15 or fewer, so he wasn't even being used. The receiving usage, first 6 games, it was great, 4 to 6 receptions. Then he had a total of 9 catches from week 7 to 14. They completely went away from him, went back to him late in the season. So the coaching was bad. But other than that, this year, we talk about it now. Zach Robinson comes in from the Rams tree. Last year in that offense, the Rams went with a duo downhill running attack, which was perfect against the light boxes of today's NFL defenses. Well, if Zach Robinson brings that in, the offensive line is very good in Atlanta. Bijan Robinson may finally be used optimally. And also talk about a great weapon out of the backfield. We saw Kyren Williams used as a receiver in Los Angeles. Well, don't think Bijan Robinson is not going to be featured as a receiver as well. So this is an offense with Kirk Cousins at quarterback. I think this entire offense could blow up this year. And if that is the case, the rising tide lifts all ships, more red zone looks, more opportunities. Bijan Robinson is in a phenomenal spot to do what we hoped he would do last year. Anthony?
Yeah, I love Bijan Robinson. Now, I don't love him as much as I love guys like CMC or Breece Hall, but there is a path for Bijan Robinson to compete with CMC for the #1 overall running back spot in PPR leagues. The Falcons' offensive line, I've gushed over it all off season long. It's one of the best in the NFL. You bring in Robinson, you bring in Kirk Cousins. This offense overall should take a step forward, and Bijan Robinson should be a big part of that. Now, Tyler Algier. Tyler Algier he's nothing special. I know Arthur Smith maybe thought he was better than what he was, but he's a good handcuff. I don't see a world where Tyler Algier is going to be earning anything more than obvious run situations and maybe as a change of pace back. This should be Bijan Robinson's backfield. Now, Bijan was 31st last year in opportunity share. Should that number go up with this new system? I would say so, because Zach Robinson, that coaching tree, look at guys like Kyren Williams, look at guys going back to Todd Gurley. When they have an elite running back, they like to use that elite running back up. So I'm in on Bijan Robinson. I don't mind taking him as the 3rd running back in the 1st round, because after Bijan, I think we could start talking about a teardrop at the position going into the back of the 1st, early 2nd round.
Speaking of the teardrop, and we're adding this 3rd player in the ADP battle, and we understand that Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson are middle 1st round picks, and our next player, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions, is more of a late round pick. But I do want to bring up Gibbs because there really isn't a player tightly grouped with Gibbs, and then we deserve to have Gibbs talked about. So for both of us, I'm sure he's the clear number 3. But let's talk about Anthony. Start out talking about Jahmyr Gibbs.
Now, Jahmyr Gibbs, we talked about how both Breece and Bijan, they have that path to RB1 overall. Can you make a case for Jahmyr Gibbs? I think so. But the issue with Jahmyr Gibbs out of those other running backs is that Jahmyr Gibbs has a guy like David Montgomery behind him. And we know what this Lions team wants to do. They want to use multiple running backs. Now, I believe Gibbs is going to dominate the backfield as he did down the stretch last year, as he's more dynamic, he's more versatile, but I just don't see David Montgomery going away. And he will continue to vulture those short yardage and goal line plays from Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, what Gibbs does bring to the table is the elite pass catching upside. He's dynamic in space. He's going to break open those big plays. But again, unlike Breece and Bijan Robinson, and to an extent CMC, there is no David Montgomery behind any one of those players who are going to challenge for those valuable goal line touches.
A couple of things I'll add, and you're right. Having Montgomery, that's the big difference between Gibbs when you're matching with Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson. Both of those players are going to get heavy volume, whereas Gibbs is going to be a little more hit or miss. He's going to have to live on efficiency, and that makes it tough because volume is king in fantasy football. I say that almost every show. And last year, Gibbs did have 11 touchdowns. Montgomery was double digits as well. But like you said, if the Lions are winning games, and they're a good team, they're a very good team, and they're winning late, I have to assume the grinder back late is not Jahmyr Gibbs. It's David Montgomery. You want like innings eaters, I call them. When you have a game in hand, you don't want Gibbs in the game. You want Montgomery to take those interior carries. Also, the Lions have continued to invest in their defense. It didn't pan out last year. They were still terrible, but they drafted 2 high corners this year. One comes back from injury. Pass rush, Aiden Hutchinson keeps getting better. Maybe to get pieces that help him. If that defense gets better at all and they don't have to score 35 points a week to hang with teams, again, that's another formula for Montgomery being more involved. Gibbs is dynamic. The one thing I didn't like was how the Lions poorly use him as a receiver. They didn't deploy him well. He got some catches, 20th percentile yards after the catch. Gibbs, that's not him. Gibbs should be like 80th, 90th. And it was the types of passes, more dump offs, more flats. They weren't these routes designed to get him into space. And I don't know if Ben Johnson, I don't know if that's in his wheelhouse. Not all coaches are very well versed on how to use a dynamic weapon like this. But if they are able to figure this out and deploy Gibbs as a dynamic receiver, even with the less in volume, we could see a massive receiving season out of him. We could see like an Austin Eckler type season, because Eckler was sharing some work back in the day. We could see those Austin Eckler numbers. That would put Gibbs at the top, but it's going to take a leap of faith to get there. And so that's the only thing. So Gibbs, if you're taking him at the end of the first round because you want a running back, I get it. And there's no problem in that. But right now, we think his ceiling is limited. Anthony, rank these 3. We have Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, and Jahmyr Gibbs.
I'm going to rank him just like that. I have Breece Hall ahead of Bijan Robinson. I just believe in that offense a little bit more. And it's not even about the offense. The fact that, again, we saw Breece Hall finish the year as a PPR running back 2 on one of the worst offenses in the league. If this offense improves and plays the way I think it will, and the way we think it will with Aaron Rodgers and the upgraded offensive line, then I think Breece Hall is a strong candidate to outseat CMC as a number 1 overall running back. Bijan Robinson, similar path to that number 1 overall running back tier, but I think the path is a little bit more harder because, last year he was more of a fantasy disappointment. And of course, Jahmyr Gibbs, I do worry about that situation with David Montgomery, possibly a little bit more than most, but I think it's real. And I also like that you brought up the fact that if this defense gets better, are there going to be more pass catching opportunities, and also who that grinder back is, that innings eater. That's a great point you brought up about David Montgomery seeing the field in those 4-minute drills.
And so I'm going to rank them the same way. Like Anthony said, Breece Hall has shown us fantasy dominance in 2 different ways in 2 different seasons. And that is something as good as Bijan Robinson may be. Hall has already shown that, and his situation is only better this year. So he's won. Robinson, like we said, we saw enough last year, but I really believe in his situation. So I think taking Robinson in that mid-first round is a smart pick. We said earlier, Gibbs doesn't really belong in his ADP battle, but he should just need to be talked about for all the reasons we said. He's a distant third. But again, if you want a running back and you're in the late first round and it's a position you want to go with, then going with Gibbs makes sense. Now, RotoWire covers all the fantasy sports. Did you know you can get a free 2-day trial with no credit card needed? To check everything out we have to offer, get that trial, go to rotowire.com/pod. Thanks to our sponsor, Prize Picks, the best way to get action on sports in more than 30 states across the country. And thanks to everyone for listening. Come back next week for another edition of the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast.